Welcome. No errors here.
Oh, wait. The error is that my voice was not on. So no one even heard me. How about that? It's errors on top of errors.
No. Error is no, Steven. We'll just have to do it with the two of us.
No, I'm back on. I'm back on. I'm back on. Well, this new intro has messed me all up. And everyone's a flutter because we got James Sutter. Look at that. I did a little rhyme on the show.
Was that on purpose?
Yeah, no. I mean, yes. So there we go. And I take no credit for this because James being proactive. James, you might be the first guest who actually reached out. I think you are the first guest who reached out to us to be on the show.
Maybe a few of the other streamers did occasionally, but
well, I can tell you people were enjoying watching your show, and I'm admittedly doing the press junket for my new novel, so I was like, this could be fun. Let's go hang out.
Yeah. So we have James on, and now why don't you explain to everyone who you are and why you're such a big deal?
I don't know about the big deal, but so hi everybody. I'm James L. Sutter, and I am one of the co-creators of Pathfinder and Starfinder. I worked at Paizo for 13 years and then have been freelancing for the last 5 years or so. And so in that time, I started out on Dungeon Magazine and then worked, I was working on Pathfinder when we first created that as a developer, editor, writer. And then eventually I got to do a bunch of different jobs, including being the executive editor of the Pathfinder Tales line. So all of those novels that we did, and also being the creative director for Starfinder, where I got to work with a whole bunch of great folks, including Mark, to build that game. And so I've also written comics like the Pathfinder comics and the new Starfinder comics that are coming out this month. But nowadays I'm primarily a novelist. So I had done Death's Heretic and the Redemption Engine, which are two Pathfinder novels. But my new novel, Dark Hearts, is a queer young adult contemporary romance all about falling in love with the boy who stole your chance at rock stardom. So that's and that just came out last night, so I'm fresh off the launch party of that. But yeah, so that's kind of what I'm doing these days. But I still do work for both Paizo and WotC in terms of writing adventures. Like on the Wizards side, I recently did the Dragonlance. I did part of the Dragonlance adventure. Same, I did Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. I did some setting work on that and various other projects. And then for Paizo, I think my most recent thing there was the Gatewalker's Adventure Path, which I got to kick off, which was a little bit of I felt like I got ambushed into that one because I thought I didn't have time to write an adventure because I was on novel deadline. And then Patrick Reaney hit me up and said, okay, I know you don't have time, but it's an X-Files themed adventure path where you're going to go to the first world, which I know you were like a big part of, and then go to another planet. And I know the solar system was a thing you were a big part of. It's like, oh, those are my two favorite parts of the setting. Okay, fine, I'll write it. And it was a blast. So yeah, that's kind of me. I also write, short fiction. I've had a bunch of stories published in different places, and video games. I'm kind of all over the board, but yeah, that's me.
So the big thing is you were there when Golarion was built. You were there.
I was one of the architects.
You're one of the architects of Golarion. So get those super chats ready, because if you want to know about the history of Golarion, this might be your first.
If you want to know, who Caden Kalian is named after, that kind of stuff.
I want to know. I love.
If you want to know which of those random landmarks that are in Varisia did James add in to try to make it like a sky elevator type?
It's true. I did try to put a space elevator in there, and Wes Schneider and James Jacobs had to sit me down and be like, "Okay, this is cool, but like, slow your roll." It was like issue 3 of Pathfinder Adventure Path, and they were like, this is the first thing we've done about our world. You can't just put science fiction right in the middle of it right away. Aww. So I had to wait a few years for that.
It became just like a weird, mysterious tree or something like that.
So by the way,
yeah. Well, and I think maybe it was even like the Spire of Jandalay, something like that. But anyway, or Spire of Lemris, something like that.
Lemris, yes, it was the Spire of Lemris. There we go.
And then the Oliphant of Jandalay was involved in there somewhere. But yeah, no, actually, that first gazetteer was, my my favorite part of working on Galarian and later on Starfinder as well is always when you have a blank slate somewhere, a little chunk of the canvas that hasn't been painted at all, and you can just go in and throw all sorts of random stuff in there. And so some of those early things on like, getting to put, because right when I got the Varisia map for Pathfinder Adventure Path number 3, James Jacobs had created Varisia, like it was his thing, but he had like 3 or 4 towns that he'd spent all his time focusing on. It was all like Sandpoint and stuff like that. And then Wes came in and did a couple more. But then there were just these huge expanses of the map where they were like, we need adventure locations. And so I probably put 50 of them in there. And then I loved doing that so much that it was the same with, Belkzen and Kyonen with the elves. And then later getting to do whole books like Distant Worlds or First World, Realm of the Fae, or Teramaga was one where I love that feeling of asking all the other writers, hey, can I just have this thing? Can I just take this thing and go do a whole book on it? And everybody's like, yeah, sure, we don't care, whatever. And so I get to just like really deep dive and build something. Like that's always my favorite part.
So much. I actually just wanted to say I have my dungeon magazine right next to me. It's one of my favorite ones because this is not only the was it the Mud Sorcerer's Tomb?
Yeah.
But you have the Weavers. I hate to say it because you guys are all. I love your adventures, every one of you. But Richard Pett or Pete. No one, and I mean no one, writes adventures like that guy. That man is a madman. His adventures are insane.
And it's really, I think people often don't realize that, like, Richard Pett adventures. I mean, Richard Pett is amazing, but it's actually like the mind meld of him and James Jacobs. Like,
really? Yeah.
I feel like when they work together with James's development and Richard's just like raw bonkers ideas, like the two of them just sort of like form up like Voltron and create these amazing adventures, which were some of the first adventures that really got me into the magazines when I was first, started working there, started reading them. Because I had no idea what I was doing when I first started there. I started working at Paizo when I was 20. And so I, spent at least the first year just trying to desperately absorb everything I could from Wes and Jacobs and, and Eric and Bowman and just everybody, trying to learn how game design worked, but also just learn what was cool. Like they just knew all this fun media that I was just sort of mainlining.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
That was my favorite magazine, by the way. It was Dungeon.
It was so good.
It was pretty good.
And when
a
it was
lot of people have like a first dungeon adventure that they started on. Like, Sutter, did you know that the first adventure that Linda ever ran was shut in by you and Wes?
What? No, that's crazy. Because that was my first adventure. Like Wes and I, it was actually both of our first appearance in Dungeon, I think. But it was the first one I'd ever written, to the point where, if I recall correctly, I think I bought my first 3.5 rule books with the check I got from publishing Shut In. Before that, I'd just been borrowing them from people.
I'm pretty sure that she looked through the entire Dungeon back catalog and was like, well, that adventure looks cool, so I'll just get like the PDF for that one, and then ran it. Did not know who the authors were at the time that she was doing that, because it was the first adventure she ran. Yep.
Yeah, no, that was fun. And it was such an education because I knew nothing. That was pretty early on. So I didn't know a ton about adventure writing. And, Wes was only a couple years ahead of me, but that was, light years at that point. And so he was kind of helping me out and teaching me the ropes. But I also spent so much time in those early days on Dungeon. One of my jobs was just being the slush pile manager, because at the time, all the adventures were, you would submit your pitch for an adventure. And it was my job to just go through there and weed out, find the couple of ones that we were actually interested in and just sort of get rid of the rest. And I remember on the message boards for a while, they called me the render, like the gray render, because I was just mowing through all their submissions. But that was the job. And that was really the first big way that I learned just sort of what was cool. Like, by seeing what jumped out at me in other people's submissions, that's how I kind of learned what to do. You can learn so much by seeing what not to do.
So
yeah,
I have some questions. Let me ask my questions about Golarion.
Yeah, please.
Because someone who's played in it for a long, long, long time. So, Numeria.
Okay.
Whose was that? Because of all the places, it's funny. You started out with the space elevator, because when I remember when I first saw it, first thing I went to, I'm like, this is cool. This is cool. Science fiction, yes. Like, I was like, that's the place. I couldn't wait. I remember I was waiting and waiting until they finally did an adventure path in Numeria, which I thought was actually one of my favorite adventure paths. It was extremely well done.
Nice. I think that was a James Jacobs joint.
Okay,
I could be wrong, but I think I don't know. So
I think I remember him saying that because it has Androffa from his home brew setting, exactly. And other connections.
Got it.
Yeah, and it's sometimes hard to remember like where stuff really started, but so it's entirely possible that was a name that Eric put on the map or something, but Jacobs definitely took possession of that part of the world pretty early on and was like, this is like, he built out a lot of that.
So because I think it's just our age, because we've been playing for so long, is that we prefer to have messed up. It's like, I was talking, hey, Derek from Knights of Last Call, I was telling him today on his Discord, because they were making fun of me because we have Gamayan in our world, which are like parrot people. In our world of Alakar, which is the world of Battle Zoo, we purposely don't have... They're there. We have humans, we have dwarves, we have elves, we have all those.
Right.
But I never reference them. Because how many more do you need? Okay?
Right,
it's like,
right.
Do I need to really tell you that there's going to be dwarves there? Do I need to tell you that they're elves? Here's everyone else. You can fill those in. You can put those in. I don't need to tell you and start off with that. Can't that just be assumed?
In our equivalent area of Varisia, where we just kind of made that region, but not the whole world yet, kind of like how Pathfinder did that with Golarion. It just doesn't really have humans, dwarves, and elves there. Nice. They just don't live in that particular region. But there's still clear signs that humans exist, because there's like subjective gender fluid deities that appear as the ancestry that you are. And they are depicted as humans because the readers are humans, and it also they're humans.
That's right. So actually, you asked me that because Mark's like, "Wait, why did you make them human?" I'm like, "Cause you're human." And it's like, exactly. But if your dog looked at it, they would look like dogs.
No, I love that. And we actually did a similar thing with Starfinder when we were deciding which races, which species we were going to make playable in, like, so make the core ones, the core playable races. Because there was a lot of talk originally about like, well, should it be elves and dwarves and all that stuff? And we really wanted to do some new species just because creatively it would be a lot more fun and a lot more distinctive. And we still put the, sort of Pathfinder legacy races in the back of the book and updated them and gave you, because it is fun to see like, it was fun to see how have dwarves changed, how have elves changed, but we didn't want to just be, Pathfinder in the future. I mean, it is, but we wanted to have some new stuff that was really Starfinder specific. And so species like the Shirin or the Vesk or, the Kasatha, those were things that we could really create whole cloth and sort of sink our teeth into. And there was a lot of actually back and forth in trying to decide which species we would do. It was a very careful calculation of, I remember thinking a lot about player types, right? And specifically, I remember thinking about talking with Eric about whether or not we needed Yosoki in Starfinder, because I had them on my list, and he was like, "Rat people, seriously?" And I was like, "No, you don't understand. It might not be for everybody, but there will be one player in every group who loves the Yosoki, and like there probably were a theater kid in high school, and they probably like to talk in a squeaky voice, and they might wear a hat or like sit on the floor so that they're shorter, but like that person is going to love playing a Yosoki." Wow. And sure enough, we like we put the game out, and the Soki miniatures were the first ones to go. And he was like, okay, fine, you're right.
Well,
Eric has consistently needed to be convinced to add in like the cute options
stuff, yeah.
But then he will be the first to admit when he sees that they're successful to be like, you convinced me, and it was a good ad, because that was true for Leshies in Pathfinder Second Edition too. There were a lot of very senior people at Paizo who, or a few, but the most senior at the meeting when it was being discussed, who were all like, we really don't like Leshies. But then like everyone else there was like, we really want them. And they're like, you know what? We're going to listen to everyone else, because that means a lot of people probably like them. And that happened.
That's the beauty of having a team, right? Yeah. Because like you get people who have very different styles, and it's not that one's right and one's wrong. It's that, especially in a game like Pathfinder or Starfinder, where you want to make sure that your game actually can appeal to all the different player styles. So having them all represented on the team is a huge asset.
100%. And it's also very important, because some companies don't work like that the executives and the upper managers at Paizo would be willing to say, well, if all these other people think that's cool, that means there are players out there who will. Let's do it, even if it's not my cup of tea. So at some companies, they just be like, well, I'm the highest person here, so we're just going to do the ones that I like. And that's not how Paizo generally operates.
Well, and like we're a perfect illustration of that, because right. So I was the creative director on Starfinder, and I'm more of a rules-light guy. I'm much more interested in the story, the world, the feel of the game. But I was working with you, who are like the king of crunch. And so like I knew that like that's my weak spot, but you were there with all of this knowledge and all these good ideas. And so like together we could create something much bigger and better than we could have on our own. You
always pitch yourself as a really rules light guy, Sutter, but I will say this in praise of your game mechanical knowledge too, which I don't think I've told you before, although I've mentioned to the other designers, which is, so background for everyone, during the very alpha stage of Pathfinder Second Edition, the design team ran playtests that were just us and then one person who was pretty senior in some other place in the creative department came in as a guest player to play with us. And it was like James Jacobs, one time Eric Mona, and Wes and Sutter. And all of you here who play Pathfinder Second Edition have learned by now something that you might not have known on your first game session, which is like, don't attack 3 times because of multiple attack penalty. Use your third action creatively. Right. It's a mantra now in the PF2 community, but not everyone started that way. The only person who we played with who was doing that from the very beginning was you.
Really?
You were by far the one who we just showed these rules to, and you got into it and used the tactics that I thought, and the community has shown since then over years of play, were like the ones that really got into the way that it works. Like Wes's cleric was just making 3 strikes with his every turn, pretty much exactly, and other things like that. But you were always being like, no, wait, if I stop here and I raise my shield, I can get some other armor class. So
that's funny.
Logan threw at us, we were able to defend against better when we had you as our extra person.
Well, thank you. I remember that game, but I had no idea. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, I have a feeling I'm going to be doing a lot of sitting back and not doing anything.
Sorry, please.
No, you guys have too much history. You guys have way too much history. But no, we do have a whole bunch of super chats. But no, I was just curious because, I'm always curious when genres mix. I'm very much into using mixing, or I much like the peanut butter and the chocolate. So when I see like regular stuff, especially now, and I think more and more people, especially like fantasy isn't new, especially generations who grew up on Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and everything. I'm like, they you don't have to explain what a dragon is anymore to anyone. You don't even have to explain what a troll is, or an elf or a dwarf. Like that's long gone. You can go crazier, and I think. You don't watch movies, Mark. Did you see Guardians of the Galaxy Part 3, James?
I did not see Part 3, but
I haven't seen Part 3.
Oh, it's a shame. Well, definitely see it, Mark, because I can't even say it. There's a lot of what we say our mantra is and how we design stuff and it's in that movie. There is like they starts off the movie that they go to a space station that is built out of organic materials. If that sounds
nice,
any somewhat familiar, I have something in the world of Alucard we also build things. I love that concept, and I was like, damn it! I think James Gunn and I are like the same person because he and I have very similar philosophies. Anyhow, my point being is that you look at the Guardians of the Galaxy. I always find that interesting because there's like one or two humans in the whole game. Like they're very rare. Humans are rare. And I'm like, that's, I think, a big part of what makes that so unique is it's not even Star Trek, where it's like Star Trek, everyone's human, you have a couple of aliens. Star Wars, everyone's human, you have a couple of aliens. Guardians of the Galaxy, everyone's an alien, including the humans. Everyone's an alien. And I find those worlds much more interesting, but yet it seems like it's very rare or hard, I think, for role-playing games, not so much video games, but for role-playing games to get away from that. And I'll tell you, I think I know why, because famously when World of Warcraft first came out, over 50% there was 8 races that were released, and over 50, it was I think 51, 52%, I used to work with Blizzard, of the players played either humans or elves. And no one would play Horde. It was 3-1 Alliance to Horde because no one wanted to play, quote, ugly races. And I think people, like you said, it's like people just want to play themselves or part of themselves. So I think there's a big issue with trying to go away from having humans and dwarves and elves in your settings because they think people will not be able to identify with them.
Yeah, you need to have that option for the players because there are lots of players who are looking to be something weird. But there are a lot of people who just want to play a version of themselves in a fantasy or a science fiction game. And it's also a nice easy window into the world. Like it's why it's so often in fiction or whatever, it's the protagonist is the one human, just because you've got so much shorthand that you can automatically bring the reader in, or the watcher. But especially in books where, like, if the main character is, say, a Shirin, if the narrator is a Shirin, you're going to have all of this cultural context that you're not going to necessarily catch, and that can be really fun for a certain type of reader. But there's a lot of other readers who, if something isn't really accessible, they're just going to bounce and go read something else.
But that's why, like, being reincarnated or summoned into a fantasy world from Earth is
so popular.
Is so popular.
Yeah.
Right.
We did a free April Fool's product about that for Pathfinder 2 and DD5e, where you can play an otherworlder who was summoned in and has cheat powers that just let you instantly kill everything or whatever you want.
Nice.
Yeah, but what about, and I'm calling out Derek again because he's in the chat. This is a friend of ours who's on the stream a lot with us. Is that he feels that a lot of people are just playing humans with a flavor if they're playing a dwarf or humans. Like, it's like, well, you're not really, you don't know what it's like to be an elf. You don't know what it's like to live for 5,000 years. Like, I don't feel like you should just play human because that's all you have as your experience.
That's Derek's point.
That's Derek's point. But doesn't really matter. I mean, can't you just be what you are? I mean,
sure, yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of the game that works for you is the game as it should be played. I mean, I know it can run into problems at org play or whatever, but like for the most part, if your group is having fun, nothing else matters. Like the book is just and the game is just a tool to get you started. And then whatever you do, as long as you're having fun, it can't be wrong. And that's why there was always a part of me, when I was on the message boards and people would be saying like, well, what about this? What about this? And I'm just like, do whatever you want. Like, you already bought the book. We're not going to come to your house and be like, give that back, So
but
just have fun.
Well, some people need to get an answer.
Send Pinkertons after you.
They do. I get it.
No.
Well, people want
the only
permission.
time I ever, when I was a fan, asked you for clarification and you answered was when my group noticed that in Caramaga there was a gambling den called Throne Bones that was run by a guy whose name was Hugh Wong.
Oh,
And
yeah.
like, is Hugh Wang like? Is that supposed to be a pun because he owns a gambling deck called Throne Bones? And you were like,
Nope.
if only I was that clever.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a classic. Nobody on the editing team read the names out loud kind of thing. I actually that was I remember the Caramaga book, City of Strangers, was I think one of the first ones that Judy worked on. Judy Bauer, who eventually would come to lead the editors there, worked on. And I definitely remember like her calling me on a number of things, like as the book was going to print, where she was like, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. And me being like, we got to ship it, it's fine. And then later being like, quickly coming to realize that like the number one lesson at Paizo in those years was you should listen to Judy. That is still the name. She's over at Wizards now, but like I understand that they also have the you should listen to Judy rule because she's always right. That's what you want in an editor.
Yet someone else who went from Paizo to Wizards.
There's so many over there.
People don't realize how many until we started telling people. They're like, really? I was like, yep.
Well, and vice versa.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
And I mean, also so many people who are at Paizo now came from Wizards and vice versa. Like there's just not that many companies in this field that can support, a full-time staff. Like so everybody cycles through.
Only the Old Guard and Logan came from Wizards though. Like the very first crop when Wizards
it's true.
Off Paizo plus Logan at this point because Stephen Rodney McFarland isn't there anymore.
Right. But you've definitely got half a dozen folks from my era of Paizo who are now, high up at D&D and kicking ass. So
absolutely.
So do you want to go through the super chats since we've been ignoring them, Mark?
Yeah. Sure. Let's see. We've got Rage the Promised End, who said having cute, silly ancestries helps with role playing, in their opinion.
Yeah.
Their players love goblins and leshies.
Right. I mean, goblins were one of the things that sort of put Pathfinder on the map. Like Wayne's design and then Jacobs's list of like 10 things about goblins. Those were some of the first things we knew about the world, and people ate it up.
And then one person did like 4 of them that were about dragon deities and Pathfinder Society rules. So, James, do you know a lot about
I know nothing about
deities or Pathfinder Society rules?
I'm also so I haven't been on staff for 5 years now, so I am woefully behind the times.
I assumed,
and have no official capacity.
I assumed since you've not been on staff for 5 years, but I figured it was possible you knew about dragon deities. So
I can answer some of these myself, believe it or not.
You can answer. You know whether they're going to be more dragon deities. I guess that there aren't going to be, but there might be.
Here we go. Captain Relic, Breast Dragon, with new dragons coming out in the new core books. Can we see new dragon gods, both good and evil, for clerics and champions to follow? Let me tell you, I don't know about Paizo, but in the new World of Battle Zoo Indigo Isles guide, we do have the dragon god Talir, who's not just a dragon god.
It was not new because we explained that they existed before, but we didn't have like worshiper stat blocks.
We did not have worshiper stat blocks,
but given that they're imprisoned inside of a moon that was built to imprison them, and they still are in that moon.
Yes,
but they can grant powers. So we've got the worshiper stats for that.
But the cool thing is, this was the first child of the parents who are the gods of this world. And it's called the balance. I won't go into the whole system, but the first child was created because the world was filled with kaiju, and they created their child, who happened to be a dragon of all shapes, sizes, and colors, who was basically made to kill and destroy the kaiju to make the world a peaceful place. And on top of that, while they were killing and destroying the kaiju, they had a whole bunch of kids. And all the kids are all the dragons that exist in the world. And that's why dragons are so powerful, because they literally are born of a god. But after all the kaiju were gone, the dragon Talir was a little too powerful and a little too much, and they had to make other children, and they had a big family squabble, and they locked him away in his room, which is the moon.
Or in their room, they're like a non-binary, all-gender dragon that can make children by themselves.
Yes. So that is and that's going to be more detailed in the World of Battle Zoo Indigo Isles coming up. So So that will be an option, and we even have a very cool icon.
That is true.
Yeah,
we don't know about Golarion, but we sure
I don't know anything about Golarion, but I know what I'm doing. So, and
nice.
Let's see.
The other ones are all about like Pathfinder Society things.
Yeah, I wish things like Yusaki, Ariki, and other non-token ancestries better supported in places like Pathfinder Society, at least Leshy. We can't really talk about that, or since I don't know about Pathfinder Society. But they do add new ancestries, and I'll tell you where the new ancestries really shine is Starfinder Society. Because whenever I play Starfinder Society, no one's playing a human; they're playing everything except. And if you look at
Starfinder,
the latest,
has so many species.
In fact,
that was sort of one of the core design goals was like let people play aliens, like do as many as possible in every bestiary.
I was trying to remember which book I got, but it showed like all the current ancestries, which Starfinder book, and it was like a grid. It was like, the Brady Bunch times 1,000 of all the ancestries. And it was insane. There's so many ancestries now for Starfinder. And a lot of
Whereas Paizo ancestries are low enough that we ourselves have created about 50% of as many as all of the ones that are in PF2, Pathfinder 2nd Edition. But Starfinder just dwarfs everything.
Yeah, well, and that's just a design choice at a fundamental level. Like, is it a game about playing aliens? And for Starfinder, we were like, yeah, like if you're gonna have a science fiction game, you got to be able to play weird aliens, even if sometimes like that might be complicated mechanically. Like certainly the game would have been much simpler had we not done that, but it seemed like something we really needed for the play experience.
And then, I guess on the topic of world building, that's an important point. Making some of those fundamental world building decisions so that the mechanics can hone in on it. And I know that the species one was one that does make things somewhat more complicated in terms of promising page count in the future to pay off the present amount. One that I remember that made a huge difference on things was the decision that is a really tough one because both of them had some significant drawbacks. One of which was all environmental stuff pretty much doesn't affect anybody ever, and you can't tell a story about that. And the other one was you can, but now you can't play on some of the core Pact Worlds planets that have environmental concerns. That was a big decision in early days Starfinder that had to be decided. I remember because I was there with like, I have no skin in this game. I'll make whatever mechanics you want.
Right. No, and that's hard, right? Because you do have certain things that will rule out certain types of stories, right? It's stuff like how easy is it to communicate, like translation stuff. Like you on one end of the spectrum, everybody's got a universal translator and you can talk to anybody, and on the other end, you've got nobody can talk to anybody, and like that's all of those have different types of adventures that you can run. So you just have to figure out it's sort of where do you get the most bang for your buck because you're gonna lose something. And those things were tough. There were a lot of big decisions we made early on that would sort of shape the direction that the game and the setting was going to go. For instance, like stuff around like faster than light travel. Like that was the creation of the drift was a big deal because we knew we needed like interstellar exploration and whatnot, but figuring out exactly how to do that was going to make a big difference because like being able to get to a new planet in 3 days versus 40 days, like there is a difference there, in terms of how, and like communication between worlds, like that seemed like a big deal. Like, do you have instantaneous communication everywhere? Is there space Wikipedia that you can just look up everything on? And if so, how do you handle like sort of knowledge checks and things if your AI can just answer every question, right? And that's like, that was something that we definitely wrestled with, I remember.
So actually, that's interesting because in the video game world, so this is, I'm trying to remember. I got into a lot of trouble with the guys from Star Trek because, I don't know if you know this, but pretty much back in the, early aughts when MMOs were ruling the world, fantasy MMOs were doing great. And science fiction MMOs did not do well at all. They just don't do well. They were doing terrible. And
I mean, that's true in other kinds of games and things too. In tabletop RPGs, the industry wisdom was that you get 1/4 as much as your fantasy and your science fiction, even if you have Star Wars or Star Trek. Starfinder being the one exception that
well, what I was going to say is that the issue is that all these things you're saying, it's like if everything is instant, it's funny. I see all these movies like To Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, or any of these, like, those movies from the 70s. And it's like they had all these problems and they had all these communication. They couldn't get in touch with it. I'm like, today those movies would be over in like 30 seconds. They'd be like, oh, something's happening. They pick up their cell phone, they look something up, and then they call someone, and the movie is over. It's like there's just too much technology. But that's why Starfinder worked, because it was science fantasy. It's not science fiction.
Exactly.
And also today's answer for AI is of how do you deal with your AI, ask your AI, and it'll give you answer to any question is, well, it's wrong, and it just makes stuff up whatever it feels like.
It's like, unreliable.
What's the name of the Veskarian general who conquered Vesk 23? And it'll just make up a fake Vesk.
It seems likely
from these chat GPTs that'll make up a fake Vesk general, and it'll sound right, and you'll talk about it to your people from the Veskarium. They'll be like, what? You have insulted our honor. This is not a
exactly.
Well, Shadow Draken said Starfinder doesn't feel like science fiction. It's like Pathfinder in space. And I think, that's the whole point. If you want to play like Traveler's pretty heavy. Like that is science fiction in space. And that's a freaking heavy game. Like that's welcome to playing, like if you really want to play sci-fi, you can. But I guarantee if Starfinder was Traveler, it probably would have sold 1% of what it did. It just would not have done as well.
Right. No, and we were really 1%.
5%.
Yeah. But, we were really inspired by the idea of like the games that we wanted to be able to play. Like the stories, I remember making a big list of what are all the types of stories and types of settings that people really love in science fiction and science fantasy. And, it was the sort of thing where how do we accommodate as many of those as possible? And how do we decide what our touchstones are, right? And so it is like, we want a game that can feel like Star Wars or Alien or The Fifth Element or Event Horizon or whatever. We sort of made this big list and said, like, how can we generate a rule system that you can use to play many different styles of game? But we knew that, like, over and over again, like, Star Wars is not hard science fiction by any stretch of the imagination, right? Like that idea of space opera was always going to be the main touchstone for us, because we did want in some ways, we wanted to give Pathfinder the Warhammer experience, right? Where like Warhammer got to have Warhammer 40K. We sort of wanted Pathfinder to have that same thing of it'll have some of those familiar fantasy tropes, but far in the future, because that's a fun flavor. Like futuristic fantasy is delightful in a way that true hard fantasy, true hard science fiction. Like hard science fiction is fun, but I don't know. I want to see magic in my spaceships. Like that, just the creative potential there is so huge.
Mm-hmm. So we actually have, let's see, one or two more. They say, Captain wrote, it's hard to move away from humans and elves if they have other common ancestries, and the other ones are ACP free. Basically saying, like, very commonly, you'll have humans, elves, dwarves, like those are, quote, the common, and then everything else is uncommon, which already puts a, like, limitation of what those are. In our world, everything's humans are just another one of the
depending on what
ancestries.
area you're in, there's going to be some weird ancestries that are common in that area. That's how we do it. It's not that everything's common everywhere, but like in this area, here's 10 things that you've never seen before. What's common in that region.
Right, but by making
that's what we do.
Yeah, the old Incredibles, by making everyone super, no one is. It's like, well, if you don't make it so that, oh, well, this is the most common ancestry, and then this one, and then this one, and like, yes, dragons are still rare, but everyone else is like, you have, in fact, a humanoid is a human, elf, dwarf, any of those have never, ever been in any of our books yet. And I don't know if they ever will be. So
that's kind of the balance we struck with Starfinder intentionally, where it's not that humans are humans are kind of, spread out, but it's not that they are by far the most populous race. It's that they happen to be on Absalom Station. Like that's their sort of home. and Absalom Station happens to be very important to sort of the the galactic trade network. And so that was a way for us to sort of, focus somewhat on humans. So if you want a human-centric game, well, that's a good reason why humans are centric. But also you can very quickly end up in situations where there aren't any other humans around and you're surrounded by aliens. So trying to find that balance point.
So let's see, what else do we have here?
I feel like if anybody has any questions about like the deep, the creation of
now is
the Pathfinder and Starfinder, like the behind the scenes stuff, like
this is the time,
this is your chance to get the answers.
Is it.
Yeah, there you go. We can ask questions like,
first of all, how do you pronounce it? Because I pronounce it Caden Kaylin, and people pronounce it different ways.
I say Caden Kalian.
Okay.
I think almost everyone in Paizo says Caden Kalian. There's some things that people at Paizo have different pronunciations for, but that's one that I've never heard your pronunciation, Stephen, until just now.
Well, Caden Kaylin, because it's a New York thing, man. What do you want?
And that one, so he is named Caden because the girl I was dating at the time had a nephew who was like 2 or 3 or something, and I just thought, being the god of wine, I was like, drunk toddler, like that sort of. He's got a little bit of a drunk toddler vibe, and so that I just pulled that name and was like, all right, I have named one of the gods in our world after your nephew.
Oh man, now I don't know if that's good or you ruined it for me now, because now whenever I think about it,
that's the thing. You know what one still gets me is God, I can't believe none of us caught it, but I remember Jason Bowman talking about naming the Knights of Ozum, and like he waited until it was published, in like whatever book we had done, and then he's like, why they're called the Knights of Ozum? I was like, why? And he's like, because they're awesome. I was like, oh my God, you're so dumb. Like, how did we all let that through? That's so.
Sometimes it's a mistake, though. I remember, like, in a Land of Linorm Kings thing, there was like a guardian nymph whose name was like Ima Vagina or something like that.
Yeah, that was a legit accident.
Yeah,
Jacobs
I remember because Jacobs was just like, who put that in there? Whoever it is, they're being fired and they're never being hired as a freelancer again. And then he said, I have completed an investigation and I was the one who put that in there.
Right.
I'm sorry, it was completely a mistake.
Well, it's one of those things where it's, he pronounced it differently in his head, but that's why you have the editors say all the names out loud, because otherwise you run into things where you go, oh, right.
So here's one that I have for you, Hermea. So
yeah,
how do you feel about the fact that after the will they won't they with you and Jacobs on Hermea, as soon as you left, it got decided in the other direction?
I think I'm fine with it.
I figured you would be. I just wanted to ask just to be hawkish.
For people who don't know Hermea is an island nation that I created in Pathfinder, where the idea behind it is that it's sort of a utopia where a very powerful gold dragon has seen all the bad things that humans and humanoids are doing in the world and is like, I can fix this. I can make society better. Like, humans just need the right situation, they'll be perfected. So he invites all the best and the brightest and invites them to come to his island and create this perfect, super funded utopian society. And all they have to do is agree to follow his instructions at all times and to breed with who he thinks they should breed with. So it is, he thinks he's like treating it like a human with a kennel of dogs, right? Like, he's trying to breed up humans the same way that people breed livestock, which to him seems fine. Like, he's a dragon. He's so much more powerful than humans that, like, if they do it to cows, he should be able to do it to them. And so there was this long-running sort of question that I thought was very interesting, is gold dragons are normally good. So the question was, like, on the one hand, what he's doing it's very easy to look at that and be like, that's eugenics. That's terrible. Fair. But also, like, he thinks that he's doing it, like, out of the goodness of his heart. He's trying to help humanity. So is he still lawful good? from his perspective, like if from his perspective he's doing the right thing by humans, or is he totally terrible because it's fucking you because it's freaking eugenics, right? And so, you know, like Jacobs and I always went back and forth because I thought the fun of that is in not saying specifically, because you want the players and the game master to have to wrestle with it, you know, like, and it's not that I thought, like, it was never me saying like, oh yeah, you know, like eugenics is fine because a dragon is doing it. I just wanted people to come to that conclusion on their own at the table, rather than telling them flat out, this dragon is bad. But of course that's very messy, right? Like I love moral ambiguity and philosophical questions, and I love when the game lets people explore the motivations of villainous people, and come to their own conclusions. But also that can get real messy real quick, sure. And I don't always hit it right on. But
I bet you're happy with the remaster removing alignment so that people can make their own decisions about.
Yeah, I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with alignment, because on the one hand, I think it's fundamentally broken in a lot of ways, because I think that, you know, The Redemption Engine, my second novel, is an entire Pathfinder novel about sort of the question of what role does free will play in alignment, right? If you're a devil and you're just bad by nature, are you really bad? You had no choice in that. You were just born a devil. And similarly, like, if you can change somebody's alignment with a spell, is that great because now you've made a bad person good, which is certainly helpful for society? Or is that a horrible, non-consensual change that you've made to somebody else? And so, like, you're actually the evil one in that context. Like, I find that stuff fascinating. And so I like alignment in that it gives everybody something to argue about. I don't think it's a good way to, like, actually structure things in terms of objective truth. I just think it's fun to argue about.
That's fair. And I mean, I get it. That is a very interesting topic. I mean, our next month's Ancestry that's coming out for Battle Zoo is demons. And it's all about that idea of free will and whether a demon can go renegade on their sin. The sin that was the very foundation that created them, in order to just kind of deny it and break free from, like, the shackles of the abyss and just do their own thing. Possibly not because they're good, possibly just because they're like, I'm going to do what I want. And that is not, I'm not going to let myself be ruled by the predestination of this sin is the antithesis of chaos, even though I'm supposedly chaotic.
Right. Oh, you know, and I forgot to say one other before people are like, what the hell, Hermea? There was one other key point, which is that everybody in Hermea is there voluntarily. Like, they have signed a contract being like, yeah, I'm into this. And so that adds to the question of, like, what role does consent play in morality, right? Like, is it still wrong if everybody's signed up to be there? Like, I'm not saying yes or no. I think that is a fun and interesting thing where people can argue about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's another super chat. It says, pronounce Iomade.
Iomade.
All right.
No. How do you pronounce it? Is it Iomade I think, or Iomade?
No, I think I say it the same way Mark does. I think just Iomade.
Because we heard it was officially...
There are things that are different in Paizo. There are things that are the same. For instance, Kyra versus Kira for the iconic cleric is a...
Oh, it's totally Kira.
Also, well, I say Kyra, and it's about 50-50, but slightly more say Kira.
Interesting.
There's also the nefarious group of Varisian criminals that, according to the glossary, is Scarny, even though that's not the order that the syllables come in.
Yeah, no, it's definitely...
It's not the order the consonants come in, so... I pronounce it that way only because I read that glossary from an early book, and I know that James Jacobs wrote that glossary, but like half of Paizo and a lot of fans try to pronounce the letters in the order they show up, and it'll do like Barney or something like that.
Well, it's important for us to hear how you pronounce it, because I always like to go back to the 80s when people were saying data and data. And if it wasn't for Star Trek, because I don't know if you remember that, but when we were kids, there was no correct way to say it. And on Star Trek Next Generation, the first thing they had to decide is, okay, how are we going to say his name? Is it going to be Data or is it going to be Data? And they said Data, and the rest is history. Now everyone says Data, because of that. It's like
because Patrick Stewart wanted to say Data,
right? So So whatever you say is what it's going to be forever.
Yeah, well, and it's funny, right? Because people cycle through companies, right? So like there are things where I'm like, oh, of course it's Kira, because that's what we named her, when we first got that illustration from Wayne Reynolds, like way back in the day. But like at some point, if a bunch of the people who were there don't work there anymore, and the people who are currently in charge say it a different way, then like whoever's in charge gets to decide, like
the great vowel shift of Paizo.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the like beauties and also the weirdest things of working for a big game like Pathfinder or Starfinder, right? Is like you come in for an era and then you leave, and then you sort of watch things change. Or similarly, you can grow up on a thing and then jump in and start making the decisions yourself. Like the stewardship passes along, and so it's a weird feeling seeing stuff that you built change, but it can also be really nice to see what people bring to stuff and to be surprised by stuff. Like I feel like I've known a number of people who get out of the RPG industry and then are like, oh, it's so nice, I can be surprised by rule books again. Like I can be delighted by not knowing what's on the next page, Yeah. I mean, I certainly I find that once I left Paizo, I actually started gaming a lot more. Like I was gaming while I was there, but in part just because I had more time, but also when it's not your day job, suddenly it can just be your hobby again. And you can just like really reconnect with that love of like, I mean, I've had a weekly game running the entire pandemic, and I can't remember the last time I had a game go for 3 years,
Yeah. So speaking of your day job shifting and the world topic of this stream, how is it different now that you're doing world building for like young adult novels versus back when you were doing world building, there must be so many differences between a collaborative group project for a tabletop RPG setting versus just you get to sit down and create a setting for this novel.
It's so different. Well, and also the weird thing about my new young adult novel, Dark Hearts, is that it's set in Seattle. So I didn't even build a world for it, but I was trying to sort of approach Seattle as if it were a fantasy city in some ways, where I sort of thought through the same things of like, okay, what are iconic, interesting, like adventure locations that, because if I was writing a fantasy novel, like a Pathfinder novel or something, I'd be going through the source book saying, okay, I want to have an encounter here, and encounter here, and encounter here. And with this romance novel, I did the same thing, but it's like the adventures are dates. It's like pick the locations that would be really good dates around the city. And then also it was during the pandemic. So it's set in South Seattle where I live. And so a lot of it was just love letters to all these favorite places that I couldn't go to because it was the pandemic. So it's like they're going to all my usual restaurants, that kind of thing.
Were you the one who did it was just the Twitter of
New Orleans?
That's you're the one who did New Orleans, right? That exploded. I'm not even sure you did that one, but it's fascinating how you analyzed it and how it's like, this can't be real.
Send this back to the freelancer. This is too unrealistic. No one would sitting like that.
That was so funny because obviously it was a joke. Not everybody understood that it was a joke. But it is just like the whole point of it was this reminder that like all the rules about setting building can be broken as long as you have an explanation for it. And also just that truth is always weirder than fiction. Yeah, that was nuts. I actually ended up from that one tweet, I ended up on like an NBC affiliate or something, like the local news in New Orleans. They called me up and were like, do you want to come on our TV show? And I was like, what? Okay, like, this is just a dumb tweet, right? Like, they're like, no, it'd be great. And I was like, okay. And then I got on there and immediately they were like, heard you talking shit about New Orleans. It was like, no, oh God, it was a joke. It was a joke.
It was an ambush. They're like, come on, we can't wait to talk to you. It's like, how dare you rip on our great city?
It was fun though. It was wild. That tweet.
Did they have a good sense of humor about it?
Oh yeah. They were just messing with me. Okay. But yeah, no, it's Twitter is wild, man. Like I feel like every year or two, I tweet some random thought that ends up all over the place, like New Orleans or whatever. And you never know which one it's going to be. It's the beauty and curse of social media. You just don't know what people are going to respond to.
Well, that was everywhere. I think it was like on Boing Boing. That was everyone was like, it's just the right place, the right time. And then also you look at it and it's like, wow, you're right. This is the weirdest design city ever. But you know
this
what?
Bridge goes across the middle of the lake.
I know, but you go to Europe, there's a lot of very weirdly anything organic, especially thousands of years old. Those cities are very, very weirdly designed. But
well, that's why. Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, because since we did say this was world building, here's a definitive world building tip for anybody watching. Go spend some time on Google Maps looking at cities in Europe or China or whatever, looking at old cities that have been around a long time and seeing just the weirdness of street grids as things sort of grow up over the top of each other. There's so much you can learn about city design by just going in there. And also you can learn how to adequately scale a city for population. That can be a really good way to learn it, is by going and looking up populations, especially medieval populations if it's a fantasy thing, but and then sort of going and looking at the maps. Or if you're really having trouble coming up with an interesting map design, find a couple of real world cities that look cool, chop up random portions of them, stick them all together, and then start working from there. And you might find just having those weird shapes in different street grids and things can be really inspiring.
I was just going to say, I don't know if this really works with Pathfinder or role-playing games, but they did this fascinating study, is that when they built, it was in EverQuest, and in EverQuest, I forgot one of the main, this is a long time ago, it was one of the main cities, and they did the auction house, and there was 2 entrances. And because of memory constraints back then, they had to be very careful as to, if you remember, you'd walk into a city and there'd be a wall in front of you, and then you have to go around the wall because they can only show so much. So for some reason, that most people, they thought they put these 2 entrances to the city exact same distance from the auction house, because that's where everyone would go. And the vast majority of people went to one entrance versus another. And then they were looking at it, and they went through, they did this analysis, and it turned out that this one on the west, which most people were using, was 2 steps closer to the auction house than the one on the right. And it was that that small of a difference. Like people just intuitively know that it was just a little bit, just half a fraction of a second closer, and that's the one they would go to. And they were it took them a long time to figure that out. But I always think about that, when I build cities, is that people will always go, it's like water, the path of least resistance. They will always go.
Social paths, right? That's when you're doing urban design, every so often you'll find in a real world city, you'll be walking around, you'll see the park where everybody cuts across a given corner, right? That's the sort of thing where you're oh, okay, that is, had the city been designed better, there would have been a path here, Right. And I feel over time you can learn to sort of see how people will naturally gravitate towards things like that.
Yeah, but even how many times, I mean, I don't think you guys don't have kids, but I have kids, and I would have to go to ballparks with my kids when they play Little League, and there would always be a shortcut between, through someone's backyard, to get to, because it's well, you can walk all the way around, or you can go through that poor person's backyard to go right there, and people would always do it, and they just just make a path
totally.
after a while because it's like we give up.
In this day and age, I'd be afraid to do that after all the
about
people going
there is
into
that.
backyards.
Well,
it was a different time.
Well, 15 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been afraid to do it 10 years ago, but now I would.
But anyhow, by the way, they had a super chat for us saying, would you make a West March set in Battle Zoo as an alternate to things like Pathfinder Society, those who want to play non-standard ancestries without restriction? See, Pathfinder Society is its own thing, so I'm not going to be making Battle Zoo Society anytime soon, but you can take a Pathfinder Society module and play it however you want.
Sure.
Yeah, you can just play the scenario with Battle Zoo ancestries.
Yeah.
You just can't report it for credit.
Yeah, but you can just do that. You don't need our permission to do that by any stretch of the imagination. But that's something I find, James, is that a lot of people feel like they need permission, and I actually wrote you. I also did one of those. I wrote before I did this years ago.
Oh, really?
I was one of those who also wrote and asked, because I know you answered like every question on the Paizo blog, and I was very disappointed with the answer because I was looking for an actual answer, and your answer, which is what it sounds like you do for everyone, was like, it's your game. Do whatever you want. And I'm like, that's not the answer I wanted. I wanted to know what the official answer is.
Right, but it's so often like we had talked about making those trade-offs of if you say one thing, like you appeal to one type of adventure, you wall off the other. Sometimes a little ambiguity is actually important because it allows you to keep both sets of players and allow them to do what they want to do in their game.
So, but I still remember that it's like people want permission, and in like our books, we often will give varying rules or what to do in this situation. It's like, not that we don't think the GM could figure it out, but to poke them and just say, dude, you can do this. It's like, you don't need our permission. Just do whatever you want, man. It's your game. Go crazy.
Empowering GMs is ultimately what this game is all about. Like anytime I'm writing a setting book or whatever, I always try to remember, like, my job is not to give you the setting. My job is to inspire you to be creating the setting on your own, right? Like, I mean, I like to give lots of information, but I really love having a hook or an unexplained illusion or like something that could be built off of kind of in every paragraph, because as a GM, it's the questions that really appeal to me. Like, I love when I'm reading through something and something will reference like, a lost city or a mysterious treasure or, that portrait over the mantelpiece piece that speaks a code whenever the full moon rises, and then there's no more information there. I love that as a GM because that is a chance for me to, go take that thing and then build something myself. And like, I feel like the building something myself is the part of running a game that I really love a lot of the time. And so I always feel like people are paying you for inspiration. And if you can get the game master or the players to be lying awake at night wondering about something in your setting, whether it's who killed Eridan or what happened to, Galarian or whatever, or even just like very small mysteries, the point at which someone is asking themselves questions and coming up with answers, they're now doing the job. They're doing the other half of your job of keeping them entertained. And so I think that that's actually a goal.
So one thing I wanted to mention is, while we are within the 1 hour mark, is that we're going to talk a little bit about our upcoming Kickstarter, which will be our world, and that's World of Battle Zoo Indigo Isles. So we came out with the book, Jewel of the Indigo Isles, set in our world of Alucard, and we came out with new ancestries, and we came out with new dragons, and we came out with new towns, and a new religion, and everyone wanted to know more about it. So now we're going to come out with a book that goes well into the details, and we're going to have new dragons, new ancestries, town gazetteers, story hooks, lots of cool NPCs, and then we even made it an island so you can drop it into any game. You can drop it in your home game, you can drop it in the Galarian. It's just an island chain. It's like Hawaii, basically. And we even have something cool where backers can give their ideas for islands, and then Mark will write your island. How about that?
Wow.
Yep.
Mark is going to do it. You just give an idea.
We'll select a few of them based on the ones that we like there. And yeah, it's just basically a generic island chain. You can throw it into like a Caribbean style area of your setting. You can throw it into a Pacific Ocean style area of your setting. Really, wherever you want to throw it into any setting, you could fit it in Golarion because it doesn't take that much surface area of your ocean.
Right.
So it could be like
tiny.
Yeah, it could just be wherever you need it to be to say that it's in your setting, and make a few adjustments to the deities that are mentioned there, then you're fine.
So I just need to get James to do an island, man. It's 300 words. That's all I asked. 400 words.
I know, but man, I am so heads down on this next novel. So the nice thing is, so the first novel, Dark Hearts, came out yesterday. But they bought 2 books, so the second one is due pretty soon if we're going to have it out next summer. So I am frantically doing my next young adult romance. So we'll see if I get back to freelancing once that's handled. But for right now, I am all in on the young queer love stories.
Not even 300 words, but I guess it makes sense because you have to sort of turn your brain on to something else, even if it's a very short assignment.
Right. Sometimes short projects are actually harder in a way because you have to you have to load just as much into your brain
to
do a very short thing.
You can write more.
Well, that's like,
is that the limitation? 10,000 words. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. But it does, for freelancing, it does make a difference, right? Because in some ways, writing 5 comics is not that much harder than writing 1 comic when you take in all the time you spend assimilating the lore.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Jaina B had a funny super chat. They said, haven't I given enough for $2? Because Jaina B has designed
Gamayan.
The Gamayans and the Zoltzazolt, the 2 of the ancestries in our book. They won. Well, we have the RPG Superstar contest. They won, and then we had to find, we took them from our Battles of the Best story. We're like, which ones would make, not all of them, but some of them were like, which ones would make good ancestries? And Parrot People was the first one, and then we went from there, and now we needed more, and then I saw there's these, they're sort of amphibian type people.
Nice.
And we took them, and they're in the overlay. In fact, you can see them in the upper right-hand corner.
They're very interesting amphibian people who they will bully people who they're close to because they feel like they want to evolve as a species, as an ancestry, and they feel that hardship allows that to occur. So if they don't like you, they'll treat you very politely.
Yep.
And
that's fascinating.
They feel like that's just leaving you behind.
I read that ancestry, and they felt like everyone I know. I was like, that's New Yorkers. That's a New Yorker right there.
Deities who some people believe to be those kaiju that got eaten by the dragon god early on. Yep.
That sounds cool.
So, yes, but they've won twice, and 2 of the ancestries are core. Well, the one they really won because the Gamayan are like the unofficial mascots of the show and everyone. So, because they're like the big, they would be like
they're one of the most populous ancestries on the islands.
Yes, so they kind of won. Good luck to them. But so wait, what do you have coming out? Because I saw you have obviously your new book, and then you also have the Starfinder comic. I know you guys, or at least Eric, always wants to get those comics out with Dino. He always loves those comics.
Oh yeah. No, I think we all love them. And I got to write a bunch of the Pathfinder comics back in the day, which was really fun. And I always wanted to write a Starfinder comic. Even when we were creating the game, it was always like, this would be so good in comic form. And so Mark Moreland is over at Paizo and is in charge of a lot of licensing stuff now. Finally pinged me maybe a year ago and said, hey, we're finally going to do a Starfinder comic. Do you want to write it? And I said, yes, of course, obviously. And so it was super fun to come back to, those iconics. So it's using a bunch of the iconic characters, including, both a bunch of folks that I had worked on, and then also Ciravel, the iconic precog, who was developed after I was gone, but who I had seen come out and was like, oh, that's awesome. So it was really fun to, include her as well. And it's a 5-issue series that's tied into sort of the Drift Crash or the Drift Crisis campaign event, where the drift has gone weird. Nobody knows exactly why. And so there's a little sort of robotic angel type thing called the Spectra that's on a mission to bring faster than light technology to an uncontacted world. And the heroes have to help get the Spectra there and bring that technology. But of course, it's a race against all sorts of evil forces that want to exploit that world for their own ends. And so it's super fun. It's a romp. It goes to a brand new planet. It starts on Absalom Station, but it goes somewhere new. And also, I think it's got a lot of heart. It's got all the characters wrestling with different, ideas or like philosophical issues. Or like, for instance, Keskadai, who's one of my favorite characters. Keskadai is, in addition to being a death priest and sort of the medic of the team, is also a single dad. He's our bug dad character because he's a Sheeran and he's got, his kid that he carries around in a jar. And the whole purpose of that is Sheeran like to carry their young around so that they can get a sense of the world, the universe, so that they can then make informed choices about who they want to be and where they want to go. But so in this series, as he's bringing his kid into these dangerous situations, he starts to wonder, like, am I a bad parent? He wants to be here and like, this is our tradition, but I'm putting my kid in danger, And so like, that's what he's wrestling over the series, but all of the characters kind of are. And that's something that I really learned actually from writing young adult romance. So like Dark Hearts is all about this character. The main character is a kid who started a band with his best friends when he was in middle school. And then egos got big, he stormed out, and then the band got huge without him. So now he's, bitter, stuck in high school while his former best friends are world famous. And then, he reconnects with the lead singer. There's some sparks. It becomes this, both a secret romance and also maybe this is my chance back into the band. But it's funny, like what I learned in writing that is how to do character arcs for like all the characters to make sure that you always know in every scene what the emotional beat is. And I think that that's actually just as important in writing, an action adventure comic like Starfinder, because I think that you can have all the cool set pieces and space battles and crazy castles and stuff as you want, but what gives an action movie or an action comic or something heart is knowing what's going on inside the character at any moment. It's like, yeah, they're, punching the bad guys, but if you know that it's also a way for the main character to talk about the feelings that they have for this other character, and that character is resenting this other character for something else, like it'll just inform the dialogue and make everything feel much richer. So in a weird way, those two really informed each other.
So we actually
how do you balance in a comic that's like an action comic that's also based on a game, how do you balance the emotional arcs with like the world building and the mechanical content? Because my window into this would just be like you pacing back and forth and then walking into the design room and being like, hey Mark, I'm doing this thing with the evil iconics and I kind of want something that shows that Melagaster is a jerk of a mesmerist, but also allows him to help one of the other iconics from like
right.
Wait, I was like, well, there's this one that was like only I can control my puppets, where you stop a mind control and by doing your own mind control on your own ally, and you were like, that sounds like it could work.
Right,
Mark,
the only window I had into it. How do you balance all of those elements together?
I think the comics actually have real crunch in them. Like
they do,
yeah. Or they do have some rules in the back.
Yeah, they're actual rules.
Which was actually really nice to be able to write the series and then, go back and forth with some of the developers at Paizo to have them, both so that I could take some things they wanted to introduce and put them in the comic, new character options, new gear, new, like precog abilities, etc. But then also going the other direction and being like, hey, in the story, this would be a really good place for a new ability. Here's kind of something I'm thinking. Do you want to design something like that? And so it was nice that it was a two-way street. But, for me, really, with the comics, like the world building angle was sort of easy just because it's like in a comic like Starfinder, you're gonna see so much. Like we knew sort of where they were gonna go, and there was a lot of world building that was gonna have to happen. So for me, the emphasis was really just on making sure the story and the character beats were there, because that's the part that can get left out really easy. Like it's not hard when you're playing in a setting like Starfinder to make cool fights with aliens and things of that nature, but knowing what it would mean to those characters was really the thing that I had to get sorted out first. So when I was first pitching the comic, they told me basically what they wanted in terms of, we need an adventure that is tied into the drift crash and goes to another planet. And I went, okay, here's my pitch. But like most of that pitch was, okay, at the start of the comic, Quig is feeling insecure about X, and by the end, he's going to feel, better about this and learn, the true meaning of friendship or whatever, like that kind of thing. So like most of my pitch was, here's who these characters are and how they're going to subtly change, but obviously you don't want them to change wildly because they're the iconic characters. You can't have you can't write a series like a run on Batman and then at the end have him hang up his cape, right? Like they need to still be out doing the things they're doing.
Can't have Kevin and I be like, I'm never bringing my kid in a jar ever again.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop being a mystic. Now I'm a soldier.
Yeah. Obadiah is not going to swear off violence, but like, but having her learn to think about it in a more nuanced way is something that you can do, and that I think is actually really interesting. It's like finding those little bits of character growth and getting them approved by the staff was really like, once I had that, the rest of it was just like, all right, cool. Now add in the plot. That'll be the easy part.
That makes sense. So there's a super chat wondering about advice for building like darker or horror based worlds and settings.
Ooh, let's see. How do you make stuff more horrifying? I think that so the thing I always think about when building monsters for horror is that I think that not always, but like most horror works off the same couple of base universal human fears. And so I think that, right, like zombies represent a fear of of mindlessness, of losing your mind, of watching the people around you lose your mind. Like zombies are like, they're a metaphor for like things like Alzheimer's or something like that, or
and also like pandemics and diseases with the diseases,
right? And same with like the xenomorph from Alien. Like that's a fear of infestation, fear of like sort of grotesque pregnancy. Like there's, and so there's a lot of, and then vampires are often portrayed as sort of like a fear of like sort of seduction and like the problems there. Werewolves are like loss of control. They're like rage. And so I think that whenever you're designing a horror monster, it helps to think about what is sort of at the root, the thing that makes this thing scary, right? Like just giving it tentacles or, bat wings or whatever doesn't inherently make a thing scary. It just makes it a creature. But I think that if you can figure out what that fear is, like, oh, this monster fundamentally removes your personal agency, or this monster gives you a disease, like it turns your body against you. This monster turns your loved ones against you. It does, or whatever. I think that you can get a lot of horror juice out of that. And then beyond that, just like read a lot of horror critically and just sort of look at what are the things that make you uncomfortable. And then why does it make you uncomfortable? And try to play off that. Like I just published a horror story recently that I wasn't even sure was horror when I wrote it, but it sold to a horror magazine. And it's a story about a woman who time travels and takes control of her daughter's body every time she eats the placenta from her daughter's birth, which is a weird concept.
That does sound like it would be a horror concept.
It is.
That,
but the horror is like, it's mostly a family story. And the horror is that it's all about voyeurism. And like this woman's sort of compulsion to want to take control of her daughter's life and like look through her daughter's eyes. And she's doing it all, from the best of intentions, right? She just wants her daughter to succeed. And so every time something bad happens to her daughter, she eats a little bit of this placenta, goes back in time a day, takes control of her daughter's body, and like fixes the situation. But in doing so, she's robbing her daughter of agency in her own life. And I think the horror there for me came from the relatability, like the fear that, like, as a parent, you would also be tempted to take control and do these terrible things, or the fear of like the fear that you would resonate with that sort of voyeuristic desire to step into somebody else's life. And it's like, and this is getting into a whole thing on psychological horror, but like I think finding the things that make you uncomfortable and then leaning into them can be a really good way to do horror. It can also be tricky, right? Because the things that make you pleasantly uncomfortable might be a thing that is just triggering for somebody else. And so you got to be really careful about, telegraphing your punches in advance so that people aren't blindsided. But yeah, figure out what scares you and then make everything part of that.
There's a Black Mirror episode very similar to what you just described, by the way.
Oh, really? Interesting.
I don't know if you know that.
I didn't know that. I was going to say it sounds like it could have been an episode of Black Mirror.
It actually is. It's this woman who gets a chip installed in her daughter, and she basically has an iPad, and she can see through her daughter's eyes at any time she wants.
See, exactly. And like, what does that do to your relationship?
Yes,
what does that do to the child's
about.
Agency?
Yes.
What does it do to you to be able to have
that's what it's about.
Talk about helicopter
living.
Yep.
Exactly.
It's not exactly because she doesn't take over her daughter's life, but then her daughter finds out about it, and then it's like, ooh, and then it gets bad.
Also, I guess I should say, if anybody's interested, that story is called To Cheer As They Leave You Behind, and it's on Nightmare Magazine for free, so you can read it or listen to the audio version.
What's your scariest story that you've ever read then?
The scariest story that I've ever read.
What scares you? It doesn't have to be the scariest.
Let's see. I think that just one that jumps out at me immediately is Horns by Joe Hill. I really like, and that's one where it's a pretty simple premise where the character wakes up one day and can just see the dark thoughts inside everybody else and make them act on them. And so it's one of those things where like he's not making people do stuff necessarily, but he can see the ugly little urges that they have, and he can sort of, in a very devilish way, kind of be like, tap, and then they'll follow through on their own ugly urges. And that also really played with that sort of like feeling of voyeurism and like seeing inside other people the parts that they don't want you to see, and just how uncomfortable that is, but how uncomfortably compelling that is, right? Like you can't look away. And so much of our culture is built around sort of that sort of sense of panopticon, and like we do know a lot of the worst moments of people's lives that we really probably shouldn't have access to, but due to the media, we do. And so I don't know. I think about that. Or I just read an amazing horror novel called Leech. Have either of you read this one by Hiram Ennis?
No.
It's horror, dark fantasy. It's like Lovecraftian without the Lovecraft, but also a gothic horror. And the whole idea, I don't want to spoil too much, but basically, imagine that all doctors in this world are a single hive mind parasite that have decided to become symbiotic with humanity. And the way they're going to do that is by becoming doctors so that you need them. They are very helpful, but also they're going to take over their hosts and control them. And so it's just it's a weird, messy story that went in all sorts of bizarre ways. And so I don't want to say too much about it, but it's probably the best horror I've read in the last year.
Oh, really?
You think that it might be the case that some of these horror stories that really resonate with you being about the ability to like sort of get into the heads of other people and control them is related to the reason that you're an author, with the ability to get into the heads of people, real people sometimes as inspiration, but then these fictional characters, and then control what they do in your novels?
Interesting. I had never thought about that. That's what I'm gonna have to unpack. That's a lie awake at night and go, huh.
There we go. It's my amateur
psychology hour.
Psychology
Totally.
hour. Because you said right about the thing that you find resonates with you as horror. So I was like, does that resonate with you as an author? Because that's what authors kind of do. And I remember when I took playwriting classes, one of the professors is like, people kind of hate playwrights because they know that they're going to write elements of their friends and other things into plays. Like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was totally based on some like failing relationships of friends, and they were not happy about the fact they could tell that they were in that play.
Well, and I think you often hear the advice like write what scares you, and I actually think that's true. Like, for instance, a big theme in Dark Hearts is that idea of what do you do when like you're 18 but you feel like a has-been, which was very much a thing that like I wrestled with a lot when I was a kid. I was so terrified as somebody who like started a punk band pretty young, did okay, but didn't like become a rock star. Like I had so much fear and anxiety around that idea of like, well, if I'm 18 or 19 and I haven't like gotten signed by a label yet, like who am I? Like if I'm not a rock star, like my life is over because I didn't achieve this thing that I thought I was going to achieve. And like now I've worked through that, but I can still really tap into that fear of, oh my God, who am I? Like I thought I was X, it didn't work out. Now I don't know who I am. And so like that was something that I really tried to put into that book.
So that makes sense.
I'm not sure. What's this Ollie Wright?
Yeah, we have some super chats, and this one I'm a little bit not sure.
I don't know
the
either.
question says Widdershins is so peculiar. How would you advise running it? So is that Widdershins like the District of Kermaga, or Widdershins
maybe
the queer RPG of Eldritch Horror? Or
it's probably the latter. Like,
but like,
in which case I don't know
about the Widdershins from Kermaga, whereas saying running it makes it sound more like it's the RPG.
Yeah, it's probably the RPG, which I haven't played. Although queer horror RPG sounds interesting. Like I might have to check that out.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that either. But then, also he said, "Are dentists part of the hive mind?"
Are dentists part of the hive mind? I don't think there are dentists.
They are doctors.
I think, yeah.
My dad was a periodontist. Trust me.
Yeah.
Dentists are very particular about that.
My grandfather was a dentist, but maybe the dentists are not part of the hive mind because the hive mind wants to convince you to use their services, and dentists are too scary.
Are nurses part of it? What about nurse practitioners? Are they part of the hive mind? Are nurses part of the hive mind? What about morticians? Where do you draw the line,
actually
James?
means the District of Kermaga. They have clarified. They do mean the Widdershins District of Kermaga since you wrote it, so it was that.
What about it are they finding difficult to run?
I don't know. We'll see if they answer. Isn't it a weird coincidence that there was a queer Eldritch Horror RPG that happened to be the same thing?
Yeah.
We were talking enough about Lovecrafting without Lovecrafting that
it popped up. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. Also, I should note one of the dirty secrets of maybe not dirty, but like maybe even useful secrets of world building is I do a lot of stream of consciousness writing when I'm world building. Like I find that treating it like an improv game that you're playing with yourself is one of the best ways to world build. So I'll often just come up with a list of interesting sounding names with no idea what they are, and then I'll go back through later and try to like write something that either justifies the name or that could go with it. Or like I love taking a map that's blank and just putting a bunch of dots all over the place, and then trying to figure out based on the geographical region that dot is in, like, well, what could this be? Like, why would this be here? That kind of thing. But one of the results of that is that because so much of my writing is just BSing as I go when I'm world building, I often have a pretty poor memory of a lot of it. So I have to go back and read the books and go, oh, okay, I I wrote that. Interesting.
So the clarification is just that Widdershins is so radically different than the rest of Karamaga. So they want to know how to like get that across, that when people cross the threshold, it's now like doing its own chaotic governance.
Oh. Is Widdershins the one that has where there's like all the Brothers of the Seal and everything, where everything's going nuts?
I think
this
it's
is so bad. I don't even remember. That was like the University. Just, you know what? Give me 1 second. I got the book right here.
Oh my god! So taking a break.
There you go.
Now that's a super chat. You're getting your money's worth.
That's a super chat. He has to try to figure it out. It's described as a quiet neighborhood where everyone else acts correctly, or else in Pathfinder Wiki at least.
Okay. I know nothing about this one. There's too many places.
Too many districts.
There's way too much in Galarian.
I remember Ankar Tay because it had the undead.
That's the necromancy one.
Twice born. Yeah. Oh, they're not necromancy. It's just twice born. You know.
Yeah.
It's all fine there.
Well, his description is.
Yeah. Widdershins is the residential community.
Yeah, it's like the gated community.
Yeah. Let's see. Do I have any tips on this?
Funny, I read a lot of Stephen King, and or I used to, and there's a lot of stories. He does a lot of weird 50s stories about cities, and he's very much into that. So it reminds me of a lot of Stephen King. Like there's a one story where it's like supposed to be they go into a town, and then they're all talking about the concert, and then they go and there's a concert, and the concert is like every dead rock star ever. And the concert is like 100 hours long, and they do it every single night, and they realize they're in hell.
Right.
Because it's like, oh, this seems like such a great idea, except every single, like, it's the Big Bopper and this, like, you name every single person, and they're excited because they get to perform, and all the residents have to go, and they're all like miserable because it's like constant. So he does.
It gives me really Stepford vibes, like the Widdershins, where it's just like,
it's a homeowners association gone wild.
There you go.
So for me, like that's really playing with the sort of idea of forced conformity, right? You know, it's the sort of place. It's like halfway, sort of like the post-revolution society where everybody's informing on each other. You know, whether that's Soviet or like the Cultural Revolution or whatever. Plus HOA, Stepford Wives, like all that kind of stuff. And so it's really, I think that's playing with both the idea of super enforced conformity, but also with the idea that people are actively choosing this too, right? Like they're all doing this to each other. They could just live and let live, but instead they're trying to sort of get up all in each other's business because they're so invested in the battle. So in terms of how to run it compared to the rest of it, I mean, it seems like this sort of place where your PCs instantly get arrested for some minor infraction, right? And you can run, or you could run some sort of mission there where, you know, your PCs have to go in there, but of course they're not going to know every social code or whatever, and so it's going to be really hard for them to make it through, like following every particular rule and social nicety and stuff. And so you could have like a fun sort of etiquette adventure in there. But really, I just think it's the creepiness of everything here is calm and still and perfect and dead inside. You know, like I find that really fascinating. So I hope that helps.
I don't know. The problem with some of these like hardcore horror, it's like what happens? They go to town, they get arrested for some minor infraction, adventure over. Yeah, it's like it's hard, man. It's hard to do those without jumping off the deep end. I don't know. That's me personally. I don't know. I'm finding it's just I like to have lighthearted advententures and then have horror, but the horror is something other. It's not part of that world, or that it's something that has invaded your world. And that way you don't have to conform to it throughout the entire adventure or within your society, because I find it's too hard to run.
I feel that even supernatural horror, though, like James was saying, has echoes of things that we are afraid of in the real world too, that there's sort of parallels that link them together.
Well, I took one of those writing classes, and that's the first thing the professor made us do is like write down what our like scariest thing was, and then like a piece of paper, and then he went around and like talked about them and explained. And then I remember he went through and he threw them all out. He's like, these are all terrible. I'm like, oh boy, here's our first day. And then explained why they're terrible. And but he was going on to like the true psychological horror and stuff. And that's a shame none of you saw Guardians of the Galaxy 3, because Guardians of the Galaxy 3,
I heard it's pretty dark.
It is. I saw it, and then I brought my son. I was like, did you like it? And then he's like, no. I'm like, really? And he's like, I was crying the whole movie.
That's
2.5 hours long. It is. It's great though. Like, but I said to him, after, I'm like, yeah, but there you go. That's humanity. Like, that shows you, like, I feel these new movies, especially in the last 20 years, I'm just going on a tangent, are very neuterized. They're very neutered. Like, these bad guys aren't really bad. Like, this guy is bad. And he's bad. Why? Does he want to do world domination? No. He wants to experiment on people and animals and make them into something they're not. And they show it in detail. And people are messed up. It's like, wow, this is not fooling around. Like, they...
Right. Well, and that ties into both body horror and cruelty to animals and stuff, which are two major, like, triggers for a lot of people.
Exactly. So. But at the same time, it makes you feel like, how many times have you seen a movie and you're just like, yeah, whatever, and you don't feel anything? You just, like, you see all this stuff happen, but then you see movies like this and you feel something, like the really good horror movies, the really good adventure action movies.
I get it. Yeah,
it's like, or I remember,
it definitely wouldn't be my style, but
right, no, right. It's not everyone's style. Same way, I don't really like body. Like, I don't like body horror. Like, I don't like any of those movies. I have friends who love that. Right, I hate that. But remember, I'm sure most of you saw Endgame. Like, after Endgame, and then he does the snap. Not Endgame, Infinity War, and he snaps.
Yeah,
and the whole theater's silent, and everyone's like, did everyone just die?
Right.
And it's like, and the movie's over, and you're like, what just happened? And everyone's just leaving.
Weirdly, for me, that had less impact than the other deaths up until that point in that film, because the other deaths, I was like, oh wow, that character died. Whereas when everybody died, I was just like, oh, whatever.
It's going to get
obviously all going to get reversed.
Yeah.
Whereas the individual deaths, I was like, oh, well, this person's dead. That's it. This is probably how they're dying.
That makes sense.
And after the snap, I was like, maybe they're going to reverse some of those other earlier things. So I actually lost some of the tension I had gained. But Stephen, you're right about most people's reactions. I know that other people did not have the same reaction I did, but it was just sort of my sort of meta story senses was just like, well, I guess nobody's dead then if this many people are dead.
But my point is just like what you were saying, it's like when you do horror, it's like if you do horror right, it's almost too much. And in fact, I mean, Mark and I were talking about this. I don't want to give spoilers, but in Jewel the Indigo Island, some of the other adventure paths that I've been running for other people, we have to put in a lot of trigger warnings because we go pretty dark into really dark, dangerous places. And
in a few points, even though it's bright and colorful in a lot of the other places.
Yeah, but that's the Pixar.
Like Toy Story, right?
Pixar is a trick. And see, so the way I write things, James, is I use a lot of movie writing and script writing techniques. That's how I write stuff for my adventures, which I find no one really does, strangely. It's actually, I guess just because people don't study it, but it's extremely well known, and there's a lot of...
We had an episode on it. My dad doesn't usually care about these, but he was like, I like movies. I wanted to watch your episode on the movies, and he said he really liked that episode.
That was one of our most popular episodes, because I showed like how you use it. So one of the things they do, and I don't know if you noticed, in all Pixar movies, there's a dark area. Like, there's something very dark and very scary. And they do that. And some of it gets really dark, like to the point, like, oh my God, is this a children's movie? But because there's a couple reasons, if you do that, it causes you to make core memories, because any strong emotional reaction causes core memories, and then you remember it, even if you don't remember exactly what happens, but you remember it, and then it puts in an association with Pixar that's more strong and like more strongly remembered in your memory than some other, animation. Like you'll see some other animated movie, you won't remember it as much, but like those things will stick with you and be part of your core memory, which is why horror in the appropriate time and place, especially as a conflict, makes it powerful and will make your adventure or your world or your setting or your monster stick out and be remembered.
I can see that.
Way better than, oh, there's a big scary undead zombie over there. It's like, who cares? You've seen that 1,000 times.
We've seen it before. Yeah.
Right.
No, that makes sense.
So, I don't know. I was just giving my theory of world building out. So,
yeah.
But what was your favorite thing that you designed in Galarian?
Oh my God.
Or one of the favorite things. No, the favorite thing. I take it back. I want to know number one.
I think it might be the eldest, which are the Fey gods. Because I got to create them pretty much whole cloth. There's one in there that was based on a thing that Eric had done. But then, I basically got to create them, and my sort of guiding line for those is I wanted to write something that reminded me of like the Endless from Sandman. I wanted to move away from just the classic Fey court as Titania and Oberon and all that stuff, and I wanted to make our Fey gods more like the Endless, more like where they're all very distinct characters who have very like interesting flavors to them, where they don't even necessarily feel particularly like classic Fey. They just feel like weird gods that have Fey ties. And so that was just a chance to be really creative, and writing that section of the First World book was a joy. So I think that's probably my favorite. I also, Kaer Maga will always have a special place in my heart, as like that is my city in Pathfinder. Like when I think of a city in Pathfinder, I think of Kaer Maga, because it was the first full source book I'd written entirely on my own, City of Strangers, and I just poured everything, every weird idea I had into that one city. And it's a bizarre, it's like a giant, inside a sort of pentagon shaped like rock on the top of a cliff, and everybody lives inside it, and it's all hollowed out, and it's got a million different districts, and they're all wahoo bonkers. I just read like Perdido Street Station by China Mieville, and like a Magica by Clive Barker. And so I was really into this idea of like, oh, fantasy could be more than just, elves and dwarves in a medieval, like real world setting. Like it can be just weird. Let's get as weird as we can. And I feel like it worked out. I feel like we got a lot of
ideas in it. My favorite is still the troll augurs who read their own entrails.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
the idea that you could, if you regenerate, why not do augury by cutting yourself open, reading your own entrails, save money on chickens?
It makes sense, because like the real world
save
ideas
money
of
on
auguries
chickens?
is like the closer
you
were related to the thing you were auguring from, it could theoretically have a stronger magic. Like if it was like your bird compared to one that you just hunted down. So if it was from your own entrails, then wouldn't that be the strongest?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, well, but when you be reading your future, not someone else's.
But that's like when I first was developing Kaer Maga. So the whole way that city came about was actually, it was one of the very first things I'd written, which was one of the first modules we published when Dungeon and Dragon were starting to go away. Was an adventure called Seven Swords of Sin that actually started as like a delve that we'd been running at Gen Con. So like a bunch of different staffers had created different rooms, and it was my job to kind of weave them all together, repurpose them into a dungeon adventure. But then we needed a setting for, where does this dungeon take place? And so I just had like a page to come up with a city. And Eric, and again, I'm like 23 maybe at this time. And Eric comes up to me and is kind of like, because I sort of thought of this idea I wanted to do, and he was like, hey, we need something that is our Castle Greyhawk for the setting. We need something that just like can have an endless number of dungeons underneath it. And it's got to be cool and iconic. So make us a Castle Greyhawk. No pressure. It's kind of like, okay, boss, that'll be fine. But then, so I was writing this little setting snippet, and it was one of those just like 3 a.m. stream of consciousness. I'm just going to start typing any weird idea that comes to mind and see what happens. And so there were all these unexplained illusions. So it was like the troll augurs, and it was worm folk and bloat mages who believe that magic resides. They're sorcerers who believe that magic resides in your blood. So more blood equals more magic. So they supercharge their circulatory systems until they're all swollen up like the Blueberry Girl and Willy Wonka, and they have to like manage it with leeches and stuff. Or there were the sweet talkers, who were a sort of religious group who believed that language should only be used, that spoken language should only be used for the name of God, but they are unworthy of speaking the name of God, so they stitch their own lips shut. And and so, but these were all just little like one-off asides where each one got a few words or a sentence, and then we put that module out. And like, I think people liked the dungeon fine, but the message boards lit up with everybody just being like, "What is this? Like, I want to know about bloat mages. I want to know about all this stuff." And so then the act of me going like, "Oh well, I guess I need to figure out what these things are. I need to know more about this," led me to just sort of like develop the city very organically, where it was like a page in that module. And then I got to do a Pathfinder's journal about it. So like a few pages. And then I did a source book, and then I did a novel set there. And that process of building organically over time was really fun and allowed me to pack just a lot of flavor into each instance.
What about Starfinder?
Favorite thing in Starfinder? Oh, wow. I mean, first off, it would be the Pact Worlds as a whole, but that's probably too broad.
So also, that's sort of something you created in Pathfinder that then became.
It is sort of, yeah. And then like getting to push it forward. I think the thing that I'm most proud of is the Sheeran. And I've mentioned this before, but the thing specifically that I love about the Sheeran, we knew we needed a bug race, but the thing that I really love about them that I kind of tossed in at the last minute is that they used to be part of this hive mind of ravenous bugs, and then they were able to break away and gain free will. And so they I think it's interesting because their society is all about free will, because it's the thing that separates them from the ravenous hive or swarm. But at the same time, they're still very communally oriented because they're insect people. And so it's the idea of like, you can be a sort of very libertarian in some ways, but also still be very socially oriented. Like the idea that you could be a libertarian and a socialist, like sort of at the same time, like they believe in taking care of each other and being there for people. But the thing that I really like about them is that they still have those pleasure centers in their brain that the hive mind used to control their actions when they were still part of it. So every time they make a choice for themselves, they get a little burst of like a positive neurotransmitter. So they can literally get high off of making decisions. And so they'll, you can find a Sheeran who's just in a restaurant, like they're not drinking in the bar. They're just, every time they decide which drink they're going to order, that's what gets them drunk, And so the whole idea that they can get this, you can have Sheeran option junkies where they just spend all their time, hitting their own dopamine button by making meaningless choices. And
they all play Starfinder and Pathfinder because of the more character.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Just they're the ones who just make characters. They never bother playing the game. They just want to make characters because every choice gets them high.
And I just like in my Foundry account, I have 250 characters, and I chose every feat up till 20th level for them.
Exactly. And so I just love the idea of like, what would that do as a culture? If you all are sort of like wrestling with that, and you have to teach each other about like responsible choice and not becoming an addict. So that's probably my favorite for Starfinder.
So there's a super chat. Do you have any fun allusions or Easter eggs from Golarion or Starfinder that you want to share?
Oh, let's see. I mean, I don't work there. I can't get sued. So, yeah, actually, I will say, we talked a little bit about the Endless from Sandman and how those in some ways inspired me to write the fairy gods. So, the Fey god, the Lost Prince in Pathfinder is, he's described as very morose, very he's very goth, and nobody knows where he came from, but he came from a distant realm, and nobody talks about exactly where. So, in the back of my mind, I've always thought he was Dream. He was Sandman from the Neil Gaiman comics. And there's nothing in there officially. It's not actionable, but I just like that idea that he jumped out of his universe and into ours and is now sort of in hiding as the Lost Prince.
Nope, you heard that now. You heard that from the author himself. It's canon. There you go.
Yeah, good thing I have no official
capacity. Would take out his big not canon step.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. Any other cool Easter eggs that you can think of?
Oh God, Easter eggs.
There must be a million. You just can't even remember half.
That's the thing, right? I don't really think of them.
Isn't
off the top
everything
of my head.
an Easter egg?
Everything's an allusion to something.
Right.
But Paizo does try to have policies where they don't want to put allusions into things, which I always found it was a little sad that it got to the point that not just was it we're obviously in world building, you don't want to have a character named Darth Raider who a hollow sword that looks like a red lightsaber. But on the other hand,
why not?
When you're designing mechanics, having feats that the gunslinger class in Pathfinder First Edition had a lot of feats and abilities that were named after old Western movies.
Right.
And that really helped people get into the class, or the investigator had things that were quotes from in Pathfinder Second Edition that were quotes from
Sherlock Holmes or stuff like that.
Yeah, there were Sherlock Holmes quotes, or even Columbo. There was just one more thing feat.
Yeah, exactly.
If you failed your diplomacy, you can ask them one more last time or things like that. But I've also seen that Paizo has tried to at some point stop things like that. Because they're worried about getting sued, or they don't.
Which makes sense, right?
Really?
And I think for me, there's often the question of what's an Easter egg versus an inspiration. Right? For instance, there are in Pathfinder, when I wrote Distant Worlds, there's a planet that has a bunch of dragon riders on it, and they're very different than the Dragon Riders of Pern from Anne McCaffrey, but at the same time, I feel like you can't really write about Dragon Riders and not have some sort of nod to those books because they were so important. Similarly, there are a number of things that, there are elements of the diaspora, the asteroid belt in both Pathfinder and Starfinder that nod to the Hyperion series, which both James Jacobs and I love deeply. And so there's stuff about the Sarcesians who fly between the asteroids, or the River Between, which is the river that runs between all the asteroids through these magical gates and stuff. Those things are in some ways inspired by elements from the Hyperion series. But you always have to make stuff your own. You don't want to just take stuff whole cloth. And so I don't know. It's a careful line to walk, and when in doubt, stay farther away from the reference rather than closer. But it's nice when you can sort of look and be like, that feels good, and I'm not sure why. It touches on something deep in my brain.
You could just sort of be a touchstone rather than be this nature deity will just be Herzog spelled backwards.
Exactly. I mean, and there's plenty of those. Yeah, there's plenty of those little Easter eggs that, right? And nobody's ever going to find that unless they're told. So.
Well, now I will.
Yeah.
So, we're running close to the end, but
Yeah, we should
I wanted
probably get
to
rolling.
finish up with one final question that someone had here. Don't forget, like and subscribe if you want people like James L. Sutter to be on our show again. What other worlds or fantasy worlds or, novels, places, anything that you admire?
Oh, okay. Whose stuff do I really love?
Yeah, what worlds, since it's a world building episode, or settings?
I'll throw out Max Gladstone's craft sequence. I feel like that one, the world he's built there is really interesting because I always describe his books as like fantasy plus urban planning, because it's about sort of the mundanity of corporations and law and that sort of thing. And literally, like the first one I read, 3 Parts Dead, is about sort of like the utilities service in a magical world where gods supply the power, that sort of thing. And so I just really like that very sort of bureaucratic approach to fantasy. Like, I think it's really interesting where he's thinking through the implications of magic on a city or on a region to an extent that I feel like we often don't see in fantasy. Like, people don't get into the nitty gritty of how things work. So I think those are really interesting. God, off the top of my head, obviously, like N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series, that world is a really interesting, bleak, post-apocalyptic one with like earthquake magic. What else do I find really inspiring? Robert Jackson Bennett. I recently read the Foundry Side series, and I think he does a really interesting job of addressing a lot of questions around sort of the modern world through fantasy. And his magic system is very, very much like computer programming in a way that I hadn't seen before. And so the way in which they sort of hack magic devices is both not computer programming and also really speaks to it. So those are some ones that pop up off the top of my head.
Cool.
I'll do an extra. What about you, Mark? What's some of your favorite worlds?
From world building perspective?
Yes. That's not Earth.
It's not Earth. I mean, Earth is a pretty weird world.
It is pretty weird.
But I generally enjoy worlds more when they're not like it was Earth all along, or we're secretly connected to Earth and they're just their own thing and they build their own metaphysics and universe. And when they get like techie with their metaphysics and universe, I can find that amusing to try to figure out how that works. So like some of the worlds and magic systems in like Sanderson's settings, for example,
you took mine.
Interesting too. Well, you should have said it first before asking me.
I was just like, oh no, he's taking my settings, Sanderson. I knew it.
You did it. So like those are kind of fun just to think about the implications of the magic system, because also sometimes the books, that's the plot twist that you'll find 3 books later, is that that is actually a thing. There was another implication of the metaphysics of the world that drove the plot later on. So I kind of like that from a world building perspective. Let's see.
Well, he's I don't really know. I good.
Guess can I throw one more out?
Yeah. No, time's up. No, okay. Yeah, sure.
One that is very different from those, like, because a lot of those that I just mentioned were sort of like they're more hard magic systems and stuff. A very soft magic version that I like is the young adult series, The Enchanted Forest Chronicles by Patricia C. Reed, which I read when I was a kid, and they capture the sort of like whimsical fairy tale feel better than anything else I've ever read. And I love it because it's one of those worlds where you just want to sink into it. And it feels like a fundamentally kind place. And like everything is very vibrant and fun. You just wish that you could go visit, And I feel like settings like that are just as important as like, there's a lot of grim stuff out there that has a lot of grim commentary, but like stuff like Patricia Reed or like in science fiction, like Becky Chambers, like Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and that sort of series, the Wayfarers series, I think sometimes it gets called cozy, like cozy fantasy or cozy science fiction. But I really like to see some worlds where people are trying to get along. Like that's fundamentally hopeful, and that's can be really nice sometimes.
You know what I find interesting? So my wife hates fantasy, and my wife's sister, who was she used to work in children's literature, of all things.
Nice.
Hated Harry Potter. Hated it. Like, she hates, because she hates fantasy and magic.
Oh.
And she liked the books, but she hates fantasy. I'm like, why? And this is right, like, when things were exploding with Harry Potter. She's like, because it doesn't make sense. You could just do whatever. And I think about that a lot, because if you don't have really good rules for your magic system, and I do think that's a problem with some of the Harry Potter and a lot of other series, is that, well, you just do whatever. It's a Deus Ex Machina throughout the entire book. But Brandon Sanderson, and he's famous for this, he builds science around his magic systems and builds them into the world, so you know when you're reading it when things can and can't be done, because there's rules. And
well, and so he, oh, sorry, go.
No, I was going to say, and I find that's very important for a very good setting, at least for me.
Yeah, here's the thing where I think it actually changes. So I sometimes teach classes on building magic systems, and I talk about hard magic systems and soft magic systems, and they serve two different purposes. So like Sanderson is classic hard magic systems, where it is like a science. You can engineer it, you can game it out. And the people who like that sort of magic system, they like it because they can figure out how to game with it, how to exploit it, how to, if I were in this world, here's what I would do to harness this energy. Like, that's the fun. It's like puzzles. Whereas soft magic is much more unexplained, much more numinous. There may be rules, but you don't know what they are. And sometimes people will say like, oh, well, that's just bad magic systems. But I actually think it serves a different purpose. Because, for instance, fairy tales often have soft magic. And another one that's big is horror often has soft magic. You don't know how the Lovecraftian horror does the magic he does, or like how the Lich, like, you don't know exactly how his spells work, because the more you understand it, the less threatening it seems. And so you just have to be sure that you're using it in the right way. And for instance, one of the easiest ways to have a soft magic system not break a story is to have only the villain have magic. Because then, like, if only the dark sorcerer who's summoning Cthulhu or whatever has access to magic, you don't need to know how that spell works. So I think people often make the mistake of thinking one style is correct and the other one is wrong. But I think that actually they both serve very different purposes. And then there's stuff like D&D and Harry Potter and whatever that sort of falls in the middle.
I'd take it even further than that, in that I think that saying hard versus soft magic, which is a discussion that is more modern than hard versus soft sci-fi, but sort of came about, I guess, with Sanderson and a few other authors writing ones that were more hard and then writing about hard versus soft magic. I think that is an oversimplification of a multidimensional question. And so that actually teases out the difference between your two perspectives, because I think that there's something about knowable versus consistent. So classic hard magic is both knowable and consistent.
Exactly.
Okay. But I think some of those horror books and things that work well are actually unknowable but consistent. They're the kind of things where, you know, like, you ate the food in the fairy lands, or like you were impolite to a guest who came to your place and you might get turned into a beast. It's like these weird fairy tale logic that you can't really know or understand, and you don't know exactly what it's going to do, but it kind of consistently goes along the same way. And maybe the author knows to some degree. And then you don't really very often see the ones that are knowable but inconsistent, because
Right.
Those are a little
that just
bit weirder,
feels broken. Yeah.
But then Harry Potter is unknowable and inconsistent. And that's the ones that you would call, like, Steven's wife would call bad fantasy, where it's just like, oh, I'm going to do time travel because I feel like it for this Deus Ex Machina. And then we break it and it's never used anywhere else because I don't want to include it in my story, where you just like come up with fiats and Deus Ex Machinas every time because you write yourself into a corner and you don't want to. You can't do anything clever to try to figure out an interesting solution, so you just throw in Deus Ex Machina. And I would say that I would at least put it into those two dimensions, and there may be a third. Or
right. So you have it's more like an axis. So
yeah,
great. We've reinvented alignment, but for magic systems.
There you go, magic system alignment. So I would say that chaotic evil is the one that is inconsistent and unknowable. So therefore, Harry Potter is chaotic evil.
All right.
I guess that means that Sanderson's is lawful good in that alignment thing.
I suppose.
I don't know.
So you want to say? I can't talk. I got hit by wild magic. I'm actually going to be in less than an hour because I got to go eat dinner because the DM's Lair is probably like a 3-4 hour stream. I'm going to be talking about
always 3 hours on the nose.
I know. I'm going to be talking about monsters and why monsters are the most important thing of any role-playing game, and no one knows why, and no one talks about them, and no one gives them any love, but that is will make or break a game.
They're clearly at least the second most important thing, and they often get relegated far beyond that.
No, they're like, it's so at the top.
Player-focused things might be more important because of how much the players get into,
general,
but monsters are up there.
They're right at the very, very, very tippy top, and yet people think, a lot of people, don't even think about them. And I'm like, man, that will make or break your game right there. And I'm going to explain in detail why they're so important. I'm trying to get the love back to monsters. That's my mantra. Mantra. That, because it's, again, I go back to, I use my video game, and I think a lot of things you see in video games are always a few years ahead of what you see in TTRPGs. And video games, whenever you're making the games, most of the time is spent on monsters and making the monsters encounters interesting. The good ones. And yes, there's the player mechanics in the building and all that, but if you don't have good monsters, everyone seems to remember that. So it's like a big part of it. Anyhow, but where about you? What are you doing? You're doing books and comics and another book.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, and I've actually got to run off, but thank you guys so much for having me on here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested, I was talking about my new young adult romance novel that just came out. It's called Dark Hearts. It's available in audiobook, ebook, paper, wherever you get books. And then the new Starfinder comic is coming out. The first floppy issue comes out later this month, but also you can back the Kickstarter to get the hardcover when the series wraps. You can just click now, and when it's all done, we'll send you the whole thing, so you don't have to think about it anymore. So whether you are a pull list at your local comic shop person or a just get the trade when it's done, you've got options. So I hope folks will check it out. And then if anybody's interested in finding me online, I'm at jameslsutter.com, or you can always find me on Twitter at JamesLSutter, or now on Instagram at James_L_Sutter.
He's everywhere. He's in too many places.
Tell me about it, man. Like, especially this week, it's bonkers.
It's bonkers. Well,
I hope it does well for your novel being in all of those places.
Me too, and I hope folks have enjoyed listening to us ramble far afield about world building and everything else.
Saying that they really, really appreciated your wisdom in the comments that you made in this episode.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, yeah, it's hard to stay on topic when you're saying, let's talk about worlds.
Right, exactly.
It's kind of a broad topic. So, in theory, anything we said would have been on topic. Right. There we go. Are you going to Gen Con or anything, or are those days behind you?
If they invite me back, I would go. But like right now, because I'm mostly working in fiction, I'm mostly going to like young adult conventions and stuff like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, that would just been fun. I just did a library convention in Texas, and that was an absolute blast. Like, librarians are
You're like, it's like,
fun.
I went to a library convention. It was awesome.
It was, man. Like, librarians are great. They're so enthusiastic.
Is your book even going to be allowed in libraries in Texas?
Well, I think so. Actually, it's one of those things where, like,
awesome.
You hear about the bands and stuff, but at the same time, people were like, "Oh, you're going to Texas?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but it's librarians. Librarians are like the defenders of the written word.
I know librarians
written word everywhere you go." I think, some of them might end up with a band, but I think the rest of them will make up for it. So we'll just see.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and hit me up if you ever want to come on again.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much, and good to see you again, Mark.
Yeah, good to see you. Bye, everybody.